Global majority, Black, Indigenous, people of color have been at the forefront of breaking down barriers of systemic issues that affect both the planet and humanity while ushering in radical change. Whether that has been through bringing yoga to the West or fighting injustice on the front lines of society. We are so excited to be here with you to explore the heart and soul of the ancient practice of yoga with an incredible and thoughtful panel of South Asian yoga teachers, practitioners, wisdom keepers, and lineage holders. Now is the time that requires us to listen, heal historical wounds, and do something different. We enter this work as an act of community care because none of us can be well unless all of us are well. So again, welcome. We are inspired to be sharing this space with you. We are honored to gather today virtually located in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts on the original homeland of Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohicans. And on behalf of Kripalu Center of Yoga and Health, we invite you to use the link in the chat to learn about what land you are on and its indigenous inhabitants. Please take a moment to share with us the land you are calling in from by typing that into the chat. Today, Kripalu works in reverence with these lands as a nonprofit educational organization dedicated to empowering people and communities to realize their full potential through the transformative wisdom and practice of yoga. Our Amplify Voice series has been made possible because of the generous gifts of our donors. We thank them, and we thank you all for your presence with us this evening. As a part of this collective space we share tonight, we would like to center our online community agreements. So we are posting them in the chat for everyone. Please take a moment to read them over and know that by being in here in this space, you're acknowledging and opting into them. And we thank you for that. Let us take a moment to settle in a bit more together and take 3 conscious breaths collectively. Inhaling through the nose and gently exhaling through the mouth. You can close your eyes or lower your gaze. Let's begin. Thank you all. We're excited to have our Amplify artist in residence, Chetna Mehta, joining us again to share a little more about her process, inspiration, and the creation of a digital piece of art that represents the essence of the material presented in the Amplify series. Welcome back, Chetna. We're so grateful to have you here. I invite you to come on and share some more words about your process, please.
Peace and namaste, everybody. I'm Chetna Mehta. Thank you for the additional space to share more about the art, about myself, about the process. I am located here on land that was stewarded for thousands of years by Muwekma, Ohlone, and Tamien Nation peoples before my family and I immigrated and settled here, now known as San Jose, California. And I'm 3rd generation South African, and my ancestors are from Gujarat, India. I'm really grateful to be here as the artist in residence for this week, which is a really fun role that I get to play. I came to Kripalu by way of the Sacred Artists community cultivated by Iset Rose and her team. And as a multidisciplinary artist, facilitator, and activist, art is and has been my primary way of alchemy to process and make meaning and express what's going on internally and externally. Art making has also been yoga for me, a devotional practice to unionize with spirit, my mind's ideas, and my body's and my hands' capabilities. Art making has always offered so many humbling lessons in collaboration and surrender discipline and grit and freedom. So I know I am among kin here who appreciate the role of the arts in social change, even decolonization and reclamation, and ultimately liberation. So if you resonate with me, please throw in a word or an emoji in the chat. But in this role as an artist in residence, I will be a student among all of you. I will be in these sessions listening to the wisdom from some of our South Asian teachers and witnessing how you all are engaging with what's being shared. I'll be collecting threads of insights from our learnings and explorations here, and then weaving it together somehow in a visual art piece. And I say weaving it together somehow because I'm really trusting the emergence. The art that I'll be creating is going to be done through collaborative co-inspiration. Yesterday, when I attended the first session that kicked off Amplify, I came with a blank canvas. It's somewhat of a proverbial blank canvas because, as Kaveri mentioned, I'm going to be creating a digital piece of art that will be printed and in tangible form. But it was a blank canvas yesterday. And today I already have some insights based on the first few sessions. For example, from Acharya G. Shunya's teaching in Radical Unity and Tejal Patel's teaching just this afternoon in the perfection of yoga without perfectionism, as uplifted in the Bhagavad Gita. So each forthcoming session will offer even more color and texture to this piece. When Jessica, who oversees online programming at Kripalu, invited me to create some art for Amplify this year, it felt really aligned and important to bring the surely profound learnings from this series into some tangible vision. So I hope for this piece to further amplify the wisdom of our South Asian visionaries who are helping us to honor the roots of yoga and to commemorate this engagement that we're all a part of together in this time. I'll be back in session 7 on Thursday to share more about the progress of the piece, and back again in a workshop I'll be facilitating in June with Kripalu Online called Reclaiming Our Creative Inheritance, where we'll also reveal the completed piece and more about where it will be exhibited at Kripalu on Muncie, Mohican Land. So looking forward to what's to come. Thank you. Honored to be a part of this. Passing it back to you, Kaveri.
Thank you, Chetna, so much. We can't wait to hear from you later this week when you share more about how this journey is creatively expressing itself through you. Very much looking forward to that. And with deep appreciation and reverence, we welcome Dr. Anusha Sehgal as your guide for the evening. Dr. Anusha is a classically trained Ayurvedic physician with over 20 years of experience in education, clinical practice, and research. She has a master's degree in Ayurvedic pharmaceutics and has contributed to significant research regarding the safety and efficacy of Ayurvedic products. She is the president of Boston Ayurveda Inc. and lead faculty in Advanced Ayurveda Practitioner Program and the Ayurveda Doctor Program, as well as part of the faculty here at Kripalu School of Yoga, translating the practice of classical Ayurveda for the Western population and making it accessible in her primary aim. Not only that but she was my teacher here at Kripalu during Ayurveda school, so I'm very excited and privileged to be in this space with her today. Miles and I will be here to support your needs during this presentation. Our info is in the chat. Please feel free to direct message us if you need anything. Towards the end of the session, there may be an opportunity to have questions answered that have been gathered using the Q&A feature located in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom or at the top of your screen if you're on your phone. Please refrain from putting questions in the chat and please use this feature instead. Now, without further ado, Dr. Anusha, everyone. Namaste, Dr. Anusha.
Namaste. Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. So I'll just put up my presentation on the screen and we can get started. So today I'd like to talk with you all about the importance of Yama and Niyama in everyday life. And this, of course, will be a little bit in reference to Ayurveda as well, because here is an area where we can see the commonality between the philosophy of yoga and also the practices in Ayurveda, giving it sort of a reference to the everyday practical applications. So in Ayurveda, one of the factors when it comes to defining health from the beginning, we talk about the health, of course, of the body. And you see here, this is our definition of health, which talks about the balance of the doshas, of the digestive function, of our tissues, and the formation of the waste products of the body. But there's also another really important part that is significant about how we define the health of an individual, which includes the importance of that body-mind-soul complex described as the prasannata of Atma Indriya Manaha, or the contentment of the soul or spirit, of the sensory organs and the mind. And actually, this point here is where we can see the correlation between the guidance and the guidelines of the yamas and niyamas, as well as how it is actually applied in an everyday aspect as described in Ayurveda. So if, of course, a bit of a recap as to what are the yamas and niyamas. So yamas are kind of described as, or can be understood as, different forms of restraint. Things that are described that we want to be cautious about how we engage in it, or also describing things that we may not want to engage in. And though these may seem as guidelines more specific to people who are trying to follow the austere or the sort of strict guidelines of yoga philosophy and meditation and trying to achieve those higher states of consciousness, these are also guidelines that actually can be applied in an everyday basis, because what they're kind of giving us caution to here is the impact of some of these practices and how it can create fluctuation in our mind, as well as how it can sometimes create challenges in even our everyday type of functions, such as making decisions or how we experience different interactions, or also the challenges that we may face based on what is the state of our mind. So these guidelines are actually meant to give us practices, specific practices of things we want to avoid and also things we want to engage in, as to how it helps to sustain the mind, helps to cultivate healthy habits, and not just for the practice of going into deeper stages of consciousness or in meditative states, but also how it helps in regulating our everyday experience. As we know, we are in a state where there is a lot of crisis around mental health. But these factors here are factors that actually can help to guide us in how to redevelop or how to cultivate more stability, more calmness, as well as tranquility in the mind, as well as how that supports then our everyday decision-making process, our behavioral patterns, and also our emotional health and spiritual health. So the 5 yamas as described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are ahimsa, or non-injury or non-violence, satya, truthfulness, asteya, non-stealing or non-appropriation, brahmacharya, which is conservation of energy and also sometimes described as celibacy, aparigraha, which is non-attachment or non-possessiveness. So the regular practice of the yamas should be done for one's own spiritual upliftment and not really based on convenience or selectivity. These are kind of guidelines that they're recommending that you want to at least keep as, the practices that we engage in, or the things that we want to be wary of on a regular basis. So if we go through each one of these, it actually helps us to understand the role of these practices and how that actually contributes to our everyday emotional experiences. So ahimsa, typically translated as non-violence, is cultivation on mutual respect for oneself as well as for others. So we're not just talking about, the literal translation of violence or harm, but violence can sometimes manifest in many different ways. Violence can manifest in the context of the thoughts that someone has, the speech, how they speak, as well as the actions that are based upon these different types of thoughts. So to be aware and present about how our thoughts, our speech, our actions are either creating a negative impact on someone else, and also more importantly, how it can create a negative impact on ourselves. Even these aspect of ahimsa is not only in reference to not hurting others. First and foremost, it means not hurting yourself. And in the yoga philosophy, there's a beauty in how they describe this, because it's also reminding us of the divinity amongst all of us. So if we are recognizing that divinity, if we are recognizing the similarity between ourselves and others, that we are all divine, that actually can help to modify that sort of negative component or that negative thought. And you wouldn't want to hurt yourself. You also wouldn't want to hurt someone else. So in that context of just trying to cultivate this habit helps to, it tends to modify this aspect of the mind and its tendency towards negativity. When it's not regulated, that negativity can translate to aversion or loathing of oneself or loathing of something else. And if we don't respect or don't have that sort of mutual understanding about ourselves as well as with others, sometimes that can allow the mind, or it gives way for the mind to follow that trajectory of negativity to the point where it can become harmful. That negativity is not only manifesting in the form of thoughts, but it's also manifesting then in the form of speech as well as actions. So in that, if we are engaging with ahimsa, there is cultivation of respect, love, and compassion. And that is sort of an aura that we build around ourselves that also benefits, again, not only you, but also all those around you. So therefore, we want to cultivate the practice of ahimsa in the context of, even from our everyday thoughts, be present, be aware of what we are thinking. Think of sometimes, like sometimes it can be easy to think about not harming others, but it sometimes can be more of a challenge to not harm ourselves. Think of like our internal dialogue. In certain situations, we can be sometimes pretty hard on ourselves, and think of the kind of language that we use when we are having a discussion with ourselves. So be mindful of that, of, again, having that compassion, that respect, that love. In the beginning, it may seem hard, but the more you cultivate the habit, the more you start to see this variation really permeating through how you think, how you speak to yourself, and then that also translates outwards in how you interact with others as well. So the next is satya, as truthfulness. So the implementation of truth on a regular basis, of course, can be difficult, especially as they describe in Kali Yuga, or the time that we live in now. The ideas of truth can be really hard. It can be sometimes even hard to identify. In many instances, it's always sometimes a little easier if you can just get away with the things with a little white lie. However, when we engage in that, and the more frequently we engage in that, the mind and the soul is witnessing that deviation from the truth. The more often and frequently we engage in such activities that are false, the more comfortable the mind becomes with falsehood. And that then leads to promotion of more of rajas and tamas in the mind. Now, we know rajas and tamas are inherent qualities of the mind, just like sattva, and they are essential. However, they do need to be regulated. And how we regulate them, that they do not enhance or become predominant and start to influence or cloud the mind, is by looking at the activities and the things that we engage in. So our thoughts, again, influence our speech and our behavior. By choosing truth, it helps to permeate in creating truthful speech as well as truth-based type of actions. Therefore, what you think becomes truth. It becomes reality. So an easy example of how we see this is positive affirmations. If we think in a positive way, sometimes it can be hard for us to believe the things we say in our positive affirmations. But we do know the more frequently we engage in those positive affirmations, those thoughts then translate to actual shift and change, and it becomes that reality for that person. So it's not just an idea of, faking till you make it. It's kind of thinking of the thoughts of what you want to induce or how you want to have that creation around you. Our thoughts are very powerful. So Swami Krishnananda says this, thoughts are much more powerful than even action because they're the action potential. So based on and thoughts, we can control. Those are things that we do have the capacity to regulate or to modify. So just being aware of our thoughts, being aware of, are they based in truth, or are they based in reality, or are they deviating away from that? The more we deviate away from that, the more those thoughts or action potentials then start to have the ability to create that kind of change, and affects then the speech will be based on those types of deviated thoughts, as well as the action and behavior also gets modified accordingly. So because our thoughts are powerful, they then turn into the real action. So be careful, or be aware of our thoughts, and we want to try as much as we can, whatever is possible, to keep our thoughts associated with truth and with truthfulness. So this is the impact of satya. Asteya, of course, is again considered as non-stealing, but it is not merely a gross form of just stealing or taking things that does not belong to you. It also means the inclination of the mind to appropriate what does not belong to oneself, or what is also not necessary for oneself. So in the Bhagavad Gita, they have this really beautiful description about how would our mind get modified to the point where it's ready to take something that is either not necessary or does not belong to you. It gets to that level of lack of discernment where it is ready to take things that can actually then cause harmful effects. So it's described as dhyayato vishayan pumsa sangas teshopajayate. Sangat sanjayate kama, kamat krodho vijayate. Krodhat bhavati sammoha, sammohat smriti vibhrama, smriti bhramshat buddhi nasho, buddhi nashat pranashyati. So what that means is when we are pondering, when there is dhyana about the different objects, things that we are thinking about, and it's starting to become a bit enticing, that the more we think about those objects, we get attached to the idea of those objects. And the more we are attached, that breeds desire, not just thinking about something, but then wanting to either attain or to achieve that desire. But with those kinds of desires born from very strong attachments, we have to be careful, because when those type of desires are not achieved or met, it leads to frustration, it leads to a lot of variability in the mind, which causes anger to arise. So when anger is there, the more intensity of that anger and frustration of wanting to get the thing that you want, but you're not getting it, that can cause the mind to become significantly disrupted. It starts to modify in its decision-making process. All decisions will get now geared as to how to achieve this desire. How do I appease and get the thing that I really want? But in that, sometimes it's going to modify those usual guidelines of things you are willing to do and things you're not willing to do. When the mind gets really frustrated, it's going to cross over some of those barriers. Those lines get blurred. And that can cause that level of delusion in the mind, or basically the mind becoming overwhelmed with that intensity of the desire, the attachment, and the anger. So with that delusion or that clouding of the mind, it also can affect then how we remember, like remember our values, remember the things that we have defined as to what I'm willing to do and what I'm not willing to do. With that level of intensity of what's happening in the mind, it can easily forget what those values are. And so when the mind, it leads to delusion of the mind, delusion of our access to our memory, our access to the things that we have defined about what our regular boundaries are, or what our values are, or what things we would like to engage in or not engage in. So in that context, when there's that level of clouded of memory, it actually also causes destruction of the intellect. It is a disassociation of our engagement with the intellect. And why is that important? Because our intellect, think of your intellect as like your Jiminy Cricket. It's kind of your consciousness, where you can actually have an active conversation, and your consciousness guides you. It guides you in the things that are supportive and that protect you, that give you that love and nourishment, but also keep you in that grounded reality and truth. But when we go through this level of intensity of desire and fluctuation and loss of memory, and also disconnect from the intellect, then all the faculties that we have there to guide us, we're not able to access them. We're not able to use them. And then we end up making decisions that are more reactive than informed decisions. So that's what they mean here, is that if the intellect is destroyed, or if we are not connected and actively engaged with our intellect, it can lead to ruin of the person, which is the same way of how that can get to the point of where we can make a decision of wanting to take something that doesn't belong to us. The mind can waver to that level of that extent. So this description here in the Bhagavad Gita, that's put in such a nice poetic way, is giving us the idea of really being wary of how this one idea can have such strong ripple effects that significantly modifies our mind and our thought process, to the point where we're engaging in things that we usually wouldn't do. Like you're doing something and you kind of internally know that there's something not right here, or this may be leading to more consequences, but you're not sure why you keep going into or getting into those situations. This is the process of how that happens. So from these strong desires and attachments to objects, it can significantly disrupt one's ability to discern or make good decisions or have good judgment. And again, it's not judgment based on anyone else. It's the good decisions and the judgment that's based on your own intellect, that's based on your own intuition. So for that, we want to be careful. So what they're telling us here is, be cautious about what's happening with the mind and what things we are getting too attached to, because that can lead the mind down a path that can be very harmful in nature. So the practice of asteya is to be aware of our thoughts and desires, of trying to covet what is not necessary. So brahmacharya, this also can be one that can be sometimes a bit challenging to understand, because here it's not only in reference to celibacy, it is also in reference to how you conserve your energy. So it's talking about one's energy by regulation of the sensory organs with their objects. That is also describing the outward trajectory of the mind. When the senses is sort of the doorways in how we engage with the outer world, right? You have your internal self, you have your cognition, your consciousness, where we process all of our emotions, all of our experiences, all that's happening inside of the body. But how do we engage with the outer world is through our senses. That's where all the input is coming in through. So the problem is that when the mind gets too engaged or too attached to the senses and their objects, it's consistently looking outwards. And the more it has that outward trajectory, sometimes the harder it is to have that inward trajectory. So a simple example of like everyday example of this is, you ever notice like if you're on your phone or if you're on a device, and I'm not saying that I'm any better, we're all there. We're all in that situation. So you've ever been in a situation where your mind is so engaged and entrapped with this association of the sensory organ with its object, to the point where it can be very hard to detach from that, like just a little bit more, or maybe just one more episode, or just one more podcast. And it can be hard to detach to the point where even if you want to sleep, you cannot sleep, because sleep itself is another sort of physiological function of where the mind detaches from the sensory organs and goes back into the subconscious. That's how sleep manifests. But if our mind is consistently attached to the senses and their objects, it makes it really hard for it to detach and to slip into that state of restful sleep. So we need the engagement, but we also need the proper time for detachment. And this is what they're talking about. Not only the engagement with the objects, but also the energy that it consumes or that is overutilized when we are engaging with these objects. So for instance, even though if you're sitting and watching TV, like you're watching Netflix, and everybody has done it. So you're watching Netflix, you're watching something, but the more hours you engage with that, have you noticed that even though you're sitting and not moving, does it feel exhausting? Like think of the last time you binge watched something, how not only exhausting to your sensory organs, but exhausting to your mind. Your mind feels fatigued, it gets dull, it feels slower. And also the body also responds to that same kind of activity. In Ayurveda, they actually mentioned this as a specific causative factor for dis-ease. How we use our senses with their sensory objects, if we are overutilizing them, that can also cause disorder in the physical body, as well as it causes disruption in the mind. So this idea of brahmacharya is, again, giving us that guidance of really being aware of how we use our energy, and also being engaged in choosing where you want to spend your energy and when you want to conserve that energy. So the mind, again, consistently engaged in that outward trajectory with the help of the senses. If this engagement is not regulated, a lot of energy is utilized, as well as a potential for agitation of the mind. So regulation of when, where, and how much of one's energy is used can help to also keep the mind focused inwards. So you do have engagement, interacting with the outer world, but it also needs time for that inward trajectory to have a temporary disassociation of the senses and their objects and their engagement to allow the mind to go inwards. And that's actually when it gets a chance for not only resting of the body and the senses, but also for rejuvenation of the mind. So a simple thing of when we do that is when we sleep, which is why sleep is such an essential function for sustenance of not only physical health, but also for mental health. So this is a description of how we see this guideline that's actually part of our everyday experience. Benefits include, if we are conserving that energy and being aware of choosing how we utilize that energy, you can see that as what helps to preserve our ojas, which is the vital essence as described in Ayurveda. Also, this helps to, again, if you have that preserved energy, it allows you to then choose when you want to use that, allows you to have diligence in your work, continuous energy, and the ability to then focus, be engaged, preservation of strength, and cultivation of sattva. This also promotes the sattvika guna in the mind. And of course, we know, why do we like the sattvika guna, or we want to promote this? Because this is the inherent nature of the mind. It produces the clarity of the mind as opposed to the clouding of the mind. So the next is aparigraha. And so in aparigraha, we have, it's described as detachment. which means that we want to be, again, aware of the same idea of the desires and the attachment of the desires and attaining the objects of our desires, but we also need to be aware of when you get those objects, knowing that everything has an impermanence to it. So developing a practice of detachment is essential for mental stability. When the mind is attached to objects or emotions or desires, it can sometimes create mental clutter. As a similar reflection is seen outside of the body by accumulating or hoarding things which are non-essential. So this practice of letting go keeps the mind rooted in the reality that everything is temporary. The more we get, again, attached to not only physical objects, but do we tend to hoard emotions? We're very good at that. We're very emotional creatures. And sometimes we will hold on to emotions. Emotions will happen as a part of the experiences that we encounter during our lifespan. However, there are emotions that come up at that time, and then those emotions, depending on if we address them or not, can either get their cessation or they can actually linger. And when those emotions linger, they tend to create really deep-seated roots. They can create samskaras. They can also sometimes really create disturbance in the mind, depending on what the emotion is, the intensity of the emotion, and how long we're holding on to that for. So here again, they're describing this pattern of being aware and present about the things that we engage in. We will utilize all the things that we encounter, whether it's physical things or objects or the emotions that will arise during everyday experiences, but also knowing that some of these things, they have their duration and their purpose, and they also need to have a cessation. Where they're temporary, they need to also let go. Otherwise, think about if we hold on to everything that we encounter in our lifespan. Not only is it going to be very heavy, but it's a big burden to hold on to that, including the emotions, including the desires, including the objects as well. So this practice of letting go of things based on there's no longer a purpose or a need, we need to let go of them, because that doesn't only allow for then clarity in your surroundings, it also reflects in clarity of the mind. It allows for then the mind to have the opportunity to engage in other things. Otherwise, if you're cluttering and clouding, you have no space to have new experiences or new emotions or anything other than what you're holding on to. So they describe that as, just as we saw in Asteya, Asteya, attachment to even desires can significantly cloud the mind, disrupting the decision-making process and also communication with one's intellect. So aparigraha is the practice of letting go of things, emotions, desires that no longer have a purpose or a need in your current experience. So if we look at the niyamas recommended, or the recommended observance or practices, for the first set, the yamas were things that we want to restrain or be cautious of. And this set is telling you about the things you want to engage in, things that you want to cultivate as a regular practice, because engaging in these type of activities helps to not only support the mind and allow the mind to stay in that state based in reality, but it also allows us to have more deeper connection with our intellect to make sometimes better decisions or informed decisions, as well as to approach our everyday experiences with the help and the guidance of our own intuition, our own intellect. So these are practices that we want to cultivate on a regular basis, that the more we engage in, the more it becomes a habit, the more it creates these very strong associations of creating stability in the mind. So even when you encounter what this saying, will this make you devoid of ever having any challenges or adversity in your life? No, life is something that's going to have some some great experiences and it's going to have some not so great experiences. Adversity is inevitable in everyone's lifespan. But what these factors do is it helps to bolster our mental strength, our resilience, our ability to cope with different challenges that we may encounter in our life. That yes, they will still, it doesn't mean that they won't be hurtful or they won't be painful, they will. But you also have a reserve that helps you to navigate how you're going to get through the adversity, how you're going to get through some of those challenges. So in that, they talk about the niyamas are shaucha, cleanliness, santosha, contentment, same word, similar word that we're talking about even as described in Ayurveda for the health of a person. Contentment, tapa, which is austerity, swadhyaya, which is a study of scripture or study of the self, and Ishvara Pranidhana, which is devotion to the Atma or spirituality. So these measures guide the mind with an internal trajectory. So the first set of yamas is careful about what we are doing and how we are engaging with the outer world. These set of guidelines is practices that you want to cultivate that help to keep the mind engaged in the internal trajectory with the inner self. Okay. So if we look at each one of these, the niyamas are shaucha, cleanliness. This, of course, helps to promote purity or shuddhi of the body and the mind. And they describe this as manoshuddhi, which is purity of the mind that allows for clarity of thoughts, processing of information, and decisions, and the sattva guna of the mind. So I'll show you in a little bit of how we describe this in Ayurveda, because we know that you have the sattva, rajas, and tamas, these gunas that are inherent in the mind. These are the mahagunas of the mind. But why are these important is the rajas and tamas will inherently be there. But why we want to promote sattva is that is a factor that consistently promotes clarity of the mind. And when the mind is in that clear state, it allows for efficiency of how we interact with different experiences, all of that input that we're getting through our senses. It also allows us to engage with the buddhi more clearly and be able to follow some of the action directives that comes from your buddhi, comes from your intellect, that's guiding you. And well, this is what this means. This is how we discern this information or this experience. This is what we've experienced before. So we know that if you do this thing, this is what's going to happen. And so it helps us to make informed decisions, and then based on that, also influence our behavior or action potentials. So in that, the sattva is really important because this allows for is the inherent nature of the mind and promotes efficiency of our mental functions, our cognitive process. Sattva also is the predominance in the mind presents with contentment and tranquility of the mind. So apart from just the processing itself, it's also allowing for the experience of that tranquility and contentment. Santosha, so leading to the next one, santosha or contentment is when there's calmness of the mind, the sattva quality of the mind, developing a habit of being present and in reality. Regulation of desires and wanting for things, as we saw earlier, this helps to promote that because contentment is being fixed and being able to engage in what is there present, not looking for what you don't have, but also being able to have gratitude in what is there. So gratitude with what is there as opposed to wanting for what is not there. That we can cultivate the gratitude practice, which is, again, another expression of that santosha. The tapa or the austerity, this is both physical and mental discipline. So it's kind of like how we engage. We do actually have this factor. We don't necessarily assign our patterns with tapa, but think about sometimes people have like a great work ethic, or they're very focused on it's easy for us to be engaged and to be on time and to have that discipline when it comes to work-related things. But sometimes it's also engaging in that same level of focus and the expenditure of your energy with also self-care and with also engagement in what feeds your soul, what brings you joy. So that aspect of discipline is not only an application for our work ethic or us being able to engage, keep a schedule, but you need to insert that in that schedule also time for self-care, also time for spiritual health. Because what that does is that is sustaining that internal component. Not just the physical body will also benefit from that, but your internal mental process also benefits from being able to engage in things consistently that support good mental health, like these sort of activities. And these are just some of the examples. It doesn't only have to be what's on here, but from the classics, this is kind of what they're alluding to, why we want to engage in these type of practices, because it helps to cultivate a very healthy type of habit. So physical and mental discipline, focus of the mind on activities such as meditation, charity, fasting, penance, spiritual duties, offerings, any of these different types of components that they recommend. And as I'll show you in a minute, even in Ayurveda, we use these same recommendations as how different aspects of how to approach even irregularities as in mental distress or mental disorders. There also we're using the same activities to help to support nourishing rejuvenation and healthy recollection of the mind. Avoiding activities that pollute the mind, such as kama, desires, krodha, anger, lobha, greed, moha, delusion, or matsarya. So these are also emotions and things that we will encounter. We cannot avoid them in our lifespan. But what they're telling us here is we want to be very cautious with these emotions. We do not want to over-engage, or also we don't want to attach to these type of emotions, because these are very good at polluting the mind. One of my students actually mentioned this as, think of them as junk food for the mind. And I was like, that's a great way to put it, because it is exactly junk food for the mind. The mind will very easily get entertained by these emotions, but it doesn't necessarily end in a healthy reaction. It usually tends to promote or cultivate more disturbance and irregularity with the mind. The next is swadhyaya, which is study of scripture or chanting, and it also refers to study of the self or the atma, swa meaning self. So it is talking about the engaging in activities or practices where we are consistently studying about the self, studying about the atma, studying about or having that introspection. So recitation and self-practice are examples of how these activities can be cultivated. The swadhyaya can be cultivated, creating long-lasting habits in the body with activities, as well as in the mind via learning, recitation, chanting, etc. So this develops deep pathways of thoughts and memories, samskaras, and impressions. And once developed, it actually becomes very difficult to forget these practices. So for instance, there are actual studies to show the impact of the impact, for instance, of chanting as sound and the vibration that it creates, not only in how it affects mental health, but how it actually affects our physical health in the context of how it can shift and create new pathways in our communication between the hemispheres of our brain. It can help in improving neurological deficits. It actually can produce physical benefits as well, apart from the mental health benefits that we know of. So this practice that they're mentioning here is, again, not just for the yogis who are engaging or creating a firm basis upon which they can carry out the higher practices for higher levels of consciousness, but even for the everyday person, these recommendations are that which helps to support our mental health, our physical health, even in how we engage in regular everyday activities. Okay, and even if things are not great, that's okay. You can still engage in it, and it will help to to transform or to modify and support it reverting back to a healthy function. So Ishvara Pranidhana is devotion to the Atma or spirituality, devotion to the self. This is again promoting more of that inner trajectory of the mind, promotion of sattva, and also keeping the mind rooted in reality. It promotes constant communication with the buddhi and intellect and prevents prajna aparadha, which again is another causative factor for dis-ease as described in Ayurveda, which means willful transgression. That what that means is if you're engaging with your buddhi and your intellect, it's telling you and guiding you based on everything, what is supportive and what is going to support your experiences, support your physical and mental health. But if the intellect is giving us directions and when the mind is clouded or when the mind is overwhelmed, it will bypass that reaction. It will bypass that information, that directive, and be more reactive as opposed to actions based on decisions. So think about like when we experience different things, sometimes in the heat of the moment when things are moving too fast, we don't necessarily think before we act, we just react. Whereas what this is saying is that as we create this habit of consistently engaging with our internal consciousness, with our intellect, with our intuition, it's trying to give you the habit of just slowing down enough that you can check in with yourself. Like, this is happening. What do I want to do? How do I want to respond to this situation? And sometimes in this case, the buddhi will usually give you that direction of what is the best way for you to respond that not only is supportive for that interaction, but also to protect yourself. So like we were talking about, for instance, your thoughts, your speech, your actions, if those are based with our communication with our buddhi, that always gives us a directive that is most supportive to ourselves. But when we don't slow down enough, when we're too fast, our mind is too engaged or overwhelmed, we bypass that process and we're more reactive in nature. And you notice that most of the time, the more reactive we are, when we do get a chance to settle in and think back on what happened, you're like, maybe I shouldn't have done that, or maybe I didn't need to say it this way, or maybe there was a better way for me to handle this. But now it's already happened. So then you have to backtrack and you have to deal with the consequences of whatever that reaction was. So this is telling us to kind of at least pause or create a habit of pausing and checking in with ourselves to decide what it is you want to do. So cultivation of positivity in the mind, which also translates to positivity in the body and positive actions. Here it benefits the person and everyone around them on a regular basis. The chitta or the mind is very chanchala, it's very erratic and unstable in nature. It requires consistent engagement to mold and develop it one step at a time. And that's actually what you're seeing with the yamas and niyamas. It's giving us that guidance of helping to keep things, reined in. So there is, of course, you all may have come across this. This description is very famous from the Bhagavad Gita as well, where they talk about the consciousness or the Atma and the Buddhi, the reins of that attaches to all five horses is the mind. The mind is the reins, and the five horses are the five sensory organs of information, or the jnana indriyas. So what helps us to control or to really keep that guidance, those reins, to be able to hold those reins in, is actually achieved by the yamas and niyamas. So not only making sure that we are consistently engaged with our intellect and our atma, but also to give guidance, to give clear directives of what we use our senses for, how we interact with the outer world, and how that also influences our internal process. And your mind, your intellect, and your atma, this is the internal process. So we want to be present enough that we can engage and we can, look at these different factors of how they interact with each other, as opposed to if we're not conscious or present, they're still there, but they become disjointed or disconnected. And that can lead to a lot of discomfort, and even our everyday experiences become more challenged because we're not having that consistent engagement with our internal process. Okay. So just a quick review wanted to show you here. In Ayurveda, we have very similar recommendations, as you can see on this list, that is part of our daily recommendation. So we have this concept of dinacharya, or your daily regimen. And in the daily regimen, this is already built in to the recommendations, not only of how we cleanse and support the health of the body, but these are activities that are considered to be rejuvenating. How does it support good mental health on a daily basis? So here as well, it's incorporating the exact same recommendations: truthfulness, devoid of anger, not avoiding overindulgence in sex, non-indulgence in violence or exhaustion, peaceful and pleasing speech, compassionate, regular chanting, cleanliness, stable and steady mind. So a lot of these recommendations are the exact same recommendations that you see from the yamas and niyamas. In Ayurveda, they recommend this, that we want to try to engage in these type of activities on a regular basis, because that is what supports. Just like you need to cleanse your body on a daily basis, this helps to create the clarity and sort of cleansing of the mind on a regular basis. So even to the context of how this is used even in Ayurvedic psychotherapy, not just in maintenance of good mental health, good physical and mental health, but also in how it is used even in the management of disorders and dysregulation, we're using very similar practices to help to recreate those healthy pathways, to help to recreate that stability in the mind. That may take a longer process, but we're using the same sort of techniques even in the management of some of the more intense variability or disorders that may happen in the mind and also reflect in the body. Okay. So I know I had to kind of just concise the end part, but I hope this was giving you a bit of the approach of not only what is described in Ayurveda, described in yoga and the ashtangas of yoga, in how we look at the yamas and niyamas, but also how that actually is very much applicable to our everyday process, because these guidelines or these recommendations it's sort of the key. It's a bit of a bit of a cheat sheet in a way of how you can recreate stability of the mind, bolster our emotional health. And even when we encounter different challenges that will inevitably be there in our lifespan, we can still go back to these practices to help to recalibrate, to help to allow the mind to reset and regulate itself back into that sort of healthy functioning. I know we're just at time.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Dr. Anusha. You're always so generous with what I like to call your casual brilliance. Thank you for going so in depth with the yamas and niyamas. We can talk about them for days, for years, right? But we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention and engagement. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to have time for questions, but maybe we'll get a chance to engage later on. So thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the session of Amplified series, Importance of Yama and Niyamas in Everyday Life with Dr. Anusha. Special thanks to you again, Dr. Anusha, and our donors for supporting this third year of our Amplified Voices of the Global Majority series. And thanks again to all of you for your presence with us online. Your support is vital to our Amplify series. Together, we uplift voices of the global majority dedicated to dismantling injustice and nurturing our planet. Your donations power this transformative work. You can head to the link in the chat to learn more about supporting Kripalu's efforts in this work. We look forward to being with you again tomorrow.